Most people thought he came back for the food. They were wrong. On the 27th consecutive night, the black SUV rolled silently to the curb outside Hawthorne House, just as the antique clock above the hostess stand chimed 8. Every server instinctively looked toward the front entrance before pretending they hadn't. Conversations softened. Glasses paused halfway to tables. Even the pianist, who had never missed a note in 12 years, glanced up for the briefest second. Julian Ashford had arrived again. The owner of one of the city's most exclusive Italian restaurants stepped out of his office, straightened his jacket, and greeted the distinguished guest with the same respectful smile he wore every evening. "Good to see you again, Mr. Ashford." Julian answered with nothing more than a polite nod. His tailored charcoal suit fit him with effortless precision, and his calm blue eyes swept across the dining room without lingering on anyone. To strangers, he looked like another wealthy businessman enjoying dinner after work. To those who truly recognized his name, he was a man whose influence reached boardrooms, charities, and whispered conversations throughout Chicago. Yet despite having access to every luxury imaginable, he always requested the same table near the tall front windows. The same chair, the same view. And then came the request everyone already knew by heart. "I'd like Miss Monroe to serve my table." No hesitation, no variation. The hostess smiled professionally while hiding the curiosity she had carried for nearly a month. "Of course, sir." Across the room, Brielle Monroe had just finished delivering a family-sized pasta platter to a table celebrating a birthday. She thanked them warmly, wished the little boy a happy 10th birthday, and laughed softly when he proudly announced he wanted an extra slice of cheesecake instead of presents. She treated every guest the same way, whether they ordered sparkling water or the most expensive bottle in the cellar. That was simply who she was. When the hostess quietly approached, Brielle already knew what she was about to hear. "Table 12 is yours." Brielle glanced toward the windows. Julian Ashford was removing his coat with calm, deliberate movements, exactly as he had every night before. She offered a courteous smile, picked up a menu although she knew he never needed one, and walked across the polished hardwood floor. "Good evening, Mr. Ashford. Welcome back." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Good evening, Miss Monroe." That was usually the longest sentence he spoke all night. She poured his water. He thanked her. She described the evening specials. He ordered the same grilled sea bass with roasted vegetables and black coffee afterward. Every evening. Every single time. The strangest part wasn't the routine. It was what happened next. Julian rarely touched more than a few bites of his meal. Instead, he quietly watched the rhythm of the restaurant. Not the elegant decor. Not the celebrities seated across the room. Not the business executives making deals over expensive wine. His eyes always found Brielle as she moved from table to table with effortless kindness. She remembered children's names after hearing them only once. She noticed when elderly guests needed extra time to stand. She quietly replaced a dropped fork before anyone could feel embarrassed. She smiled without forcing it. She listened without pretending. She made every person feel as though they mattered. Around the kitchen, theories multiplied faster than dessert orders. Some believed Julian planned to recruit her for one of his companies. Others whispered he was secretly investigating her family. A few insisted he had fallen in love at first sight. The dishwasher joked that maybe she reminded him of someone from long ago. Nobody had proof. Nobody had answers. Even Brielle had stopped trying to guess. To her, he was simply an unusually quiet customer who tipped generously, thanked everyone sincerely, and left before dessert every night. Still, there was one detail nobody noticed because nobody was looking for it. Before Brielle appeared with his dinner, Julian always glanced toward the empty chair across from him. Just once, only for a heartbeat, as though expecting someone who never arrived. Then he lowered his eyes, folded his hands together, and waited in silence, carrying a memory that no one inside Hawthorne House could possibly imagine. Brielle Monroe had learned long ago that kindness cost nothing, even when life demanded almost everything else. Every morning before sunrise, she left the small brick duplex she rented on the south side of Chicago, carrying a canvas tote bag that held an extra pair of shoes, a neatly folded apron, and a paperback novel she rarely had time to read. Before catching the bus, she always stopped at the neighborhood grocery store to buy fresh bananas because her grandmother insisted they made breakfast feel complete, even on mornings when there was little else in the kitchen. At 78, Evelyn Monroe had arthritis in both hands and enough pride to apologize whenever Brielle helped button her sweater. "You should be living your own life," she often whispered. Brielle would simply smile, kiss her forehead, and answer the same way every time. "This is my life, Grandma." She never complained about working double shifts. She never mentioned the overdue utility bill tucked beneath a stack of unopened envelopes on the kitchen counter. She never admitted that her own dreams of finishing college had quietly slipped further away each year. Instead, she measured success differently. If her grandmother laughed once during dinner, it had been a good day. If the rent was paid before the first of the month, it had been a good month. If she could help one stranger leave the restaurant feeling lighter than when they arrived, she considered herself richer than most people driving luxury cars past the bus stop. That quiet philosophy followed her into every shift at Hawthorne House. She memorized regular customers without trying. Mr. Calloway preferred extra lemon with his iced tea. Mrs. Hernandez always celebrated her wedding anniversary with tiramisu, even when her husband insisted they should split one serving. A young firefighter came every Thursday after work and always ordered soup because he said it reminded him of his mother. Brielle remembered these details because she believed everyone wanted proof that they mattered. It was never an act. It was simply the way she saw the world. Her co-workers admired her patience, although some struggled to understand it. During slower afternoons, they gathered beside the espresso machine, exchanging harmless gossip while polishing silverware. The conversation almost always drifted toward one familiar subject. "He came again yesterday," one server whispered. "That makes 26 nights before tonight." Another leaned closer. "Do you think he owns half the city like people say?" Someone else laughed softly. "Maybe he is writing a book and she is secretly the inspiration." Brielle would only shake her head with an embarrassed smile. "He is just a customer." They all laughed because none of them believed that answer anymore, including Brielle herself. There was something unusual about Julian Ashford, but it was not the expensive watches or perfectly tailored suits. Wealth never impressed her. It was the silence. Most powerful people wanted to be noticed. They filled rooms with stories about themselves, answered phone calls during dinner, or expected everyone nearby to admire them. Julian did none of those things. He thanked the hostess every evening. He thanked the busboy who refilled his water. He thanked Brielle each time she placed a plate on the table, as though gratitude came as naturally to him as breathing. That alone made him different from many guests with far less influence. Yet one detail quietly unsettled her more with every passing night. Whenever she approached his table, his expression changed for just an instant. The guarded look faded into something softer, almost relieved, before disappearing again behind calm composure. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but she noticed because serving tables had taught her to read faces before people spoke. She could never decide whether he recognized her from somewhere or whether she merely reminded him of another chapter in his life. She considered asking once, but every instinct told her some questions carried more weight than curiosity deserved. So she continued serving him exactly as she served everyone else, never expecting special treatment and never searching for hidden meaning. She did not realize that every quiet gesture she offered without expecting anything in return was slowly reopening a part of Julian Ashford's heart that had remained closed for many years. The pattern continued so perfectly that even the newest employees could predict it without checking the reservation book. At exactly 8 o'clock every evening, Julian Ashford crossed the restaurant entrance with the same measured stride, acknowledged the hostess with the same quiet courtesy, accepted the same table beside the tall windows, and waited patiently until Brielle Monroe approached with her familiar warm smile. Outside, Chicago changed from one night to the next. Rain painted silver streaks across the glass. Autumn leaves gathered along the sidewalks before disappearing beneath early winter winds. Holiday lights gradually appeared in neighboring storefronts. Yet inside Hawthorne House, one routine never changed. "Good evening, Mr. Ashford." "Good evening, Miss Monroe." Those simple words became so familiar that the bartender jokingly claimed he could set his watch by them. Brielle would pour his water, place fresh bread on the table, describe the chef's special even though she already knew his answer, and watch him politely request the grilled sea bass and black coffee. Then she would continue serving the rest of the dining room, while Julian remained surrounded by conversations that never truly reached him. More than once, Another server offered to cover table 12 when Brielle became especially busy, but Julian always declined with quiet grace. "Thank you. I can wait." He never sounded impatient. He never checked his watch. He never complained if another table required Brielle's attention first. Somehow, waiting seemed as important to him as the meal itself. That only deepened the mystery. One Tuesday evening, a well-known television anchor recognized Julian and walked across the dining room with a confident smile. Several guests discreetly turned to watch, expecting an energetic reunion between two influential men. Instead, the conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Julian greeted him politely, exchanged a few respectful words, and returned his attention to the quiet rhythm of the restaurant. Moments later, Brielle arrived carrying fresh coffee for another guest. As she thanked an elderly couple for celebrating their 53rd wedding anniversary at Hawthorne House, Julian watched from a distance with an expression no newspaper photographer had ever captured. It was not admiration in the ordinary sense. It looked closer to relief, as though every small act of kindness confirmed something he had been afraid the world had forgotten. Brielle remained completely unaware of the questions growing around her. She believed she was simply doing her job well. When a little girl accidentally knocked over her glass of apple juice, Brielle knelt beside the table, assured her everything was perfectly fine, and returned minutes later carrying a fresh drink with a colorful paper umbrella that made the child giggle through embarrassed tears. Julian noticed. When an exhausted paramedic quietly counted dollar bills before ordering dinner, Brielle convinced the kitchen to prepare an extra bowl of soup at no charge because the chef had supposedly made too much. The chef had not. Julian noticed that too. Even the smallest moments seemed to hold his attention more firmly than any expensive entree ever could. Then one snowy evening, something happened that no one else appeared to notice. As Brielle approached with his dinner, a framed photograph hanging near the hallway shifted slightly after another employee brushed against the wall. Without thinking, Brielle paused long enough to straighten the picture before continuing to Julian's table. It took no more than 3 seconds. Most diners never even looked up. But Julian's hand froze above his coffee cup. His eyes remained fixed on the photograph for several long moments before returning to Brielle. There was unmistakable emotion behind his calm expression now, hidden carefully but impossible to erase completely. Brielle sensed the change immediately. "Is everything all right, Mr. Ashford?" she asked gently. Julian looked at her, as though weighing words he had carried for years. His lips parted slightly, but no answer came. Instead, he offered a faint smile unlike any she had seen before, one filled with gratitude and quiet sorrow at the same time. "Yes," he said, softly after a long silence. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Brielle nodded politely and returned to her other tables, believing the conversation had ended. She never realized that the simple act of straightening an old photograph had awakened a memory Julian had spent years trying, and failing, to leave behind. That night, Julian Ashford remained seated long after the last dinner plate had been cleared. Outside the tall windows, fresh snow drifted beneath the streetlights, softening the restless sounds of downtown Chicago until the city seemed to breathe more slowly. Inside the restaurant, employees quietly folded linen napkins, polished wine glasses, and stacked chairs in sections that had already emptied. Brielle was helping a young busboy gather dessert menus when she noticed Julian staring once again at the empty chair across from him. This time, however, the silence surrounding him felt heavier than usual, as though the memory resting there had become impossible to ignore. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a weathered leather wallet. Hidden behind several business cards rested a faded photograph, its corners softened by years of careful handling. The woman smiling in the picture wore a simple waitress uniform, her hair tied back neatly, her expression bright enough to make even an old photograph seem warm. Julian looked at it for only a few seconds before placing it gently back inside his wallet, almost as though he feared exposing it to the air for too long. His thoughts carried him backward nearly 20 years to a season when expensive suits, private meetings, and endless responsibility had not yet become the center of his life. He had been a restless young man then, constantly chasing bigger opportunities while overlooking the people standing quietly beside him. His mother had often insisted they stop at a small neighborhood diner every Sunday afternoon after church. Julian had never understood why she refused to visit more fashionable restaurants. She always answered with the same gentle smile. You learn more about people where kindness is not expected. The diner had been ordinary in every possible way. The booths showed signs of age. The coffee mugs never matched. The menu fit on a single laminated page. Yet every Sunday the same waitress welcomed them by name before they even reached their booth. She remembered how Julian preferred extra lemons with his iced tea and how his mother liked her coffee poured only halfway because she enjoyed adding cream herself. She treated construction workers with the same respect she gave local attorneys. She greeted lonely customers as though they were old friends returning home. One afternoon, after paying the check, Julian had asked his mother why she always left such generous tips for someone simply doing her job. His mother had smiled without looking up from her coffee cup. She is not simply doing her job, she had replied. She reminds tired people that they still matter. Never underestimate someone who gives dignity away for free. Those words had stayed with him far longer than he realized. Years later, after his mother passed away following a long illness, Julian returned to that diner hoping, perhaps foolishly, to feel close to her again. The building was gone. A new office complex stood where the little restaurant had once welcomed strangers. There was no trace of the waitress. No photographs. No records. Nothing remained except the lesson his mother had quietly planted inside him. As success gradually surrounded him, he noticed something unsettling. The higher he climbed, the less genuine kindness he encountered. People smiled because they wanted something. They agreed because they feared disagreeing. They praised him before asking for favors. Authentic goodness became increasingly difficult to recognize. Until one rainy evening nearly a month earlier, when an unexpected business meeting brought him to Hawthorne House. He had watched Brielle comfort an elderly guest whose hands shook while signing the receipt. She had never realized anyone was watching. She had simply waited patiently, thanked the gentleman sincerely, and wished him a safe drive home. In that single moment, Julian heard his mother's voice as clearly as if she were sitting beside him once again. You learn more about people where kindness is not expected. Since that evening, he had returned every night, not searching for the past, but hoping to prove that his mother's faith in ordinary people had not disappeared with time. Brielle believed she was serving another quiet customer. Julian knew something far greater had been happening with every visit. For the first time in many years, he no longer felt like a man chasing memories. He felt like someone slowly finding them again. The following evening, Hawthorne House felt different before the doors even opened. A private corporate celebration had reserved nearly half the dining room, filling the restaurant with polished shoes, expensive watches, and conversations about investments that floated through the air like carefully rehearsed performances. Brielle Monroe moved gracefully between tables, welcoming each guest with the same sincere warmth she offered everyone else. She did not notice the designer labels or the luxury cars waiting outside. She noticed empty water glasses before anyone asked. She noticed a nervous young couple celebrating their engagement and quietly arranged for a complimentary dessert with congratulations written in chocolate across the plate. She noticed an elderly gentleman struggling to read the menu in the dim lighting and gently offered a brighter reading lamp without making him feel self-conscious. Julian Ashford arrived at precisely 8 o'clock as always. He greeted the hostess, accepted his familiar table, and watched the restaurant come alive beneath the soft amber lights. Brielle smiled as she approached. Good evening, Mr. Ashford. Good evening, Miss Monroe. Their exchange remained simple, comfortable, almost timeless. Yet before she could finish taking his order, another guest raised his hand impatiently from across the room. Excuse me, we have been waiting. Brielle apologized politely to Julian before hurrying toward the larger party. At the center of the table sat a successful real estate executive named Preston Whitmore, a man well known for measuring people by the size of their bank accounts. He barely looked up from his phone as Brielle arrived. Finally, he muttered, I was beginning to think this place. Forgot about paying customers. Brielle answered with her usual calm smile. I am very sorry for the delay, sir. Thank you for your patience. What may I bring you this evening? Preston glanced at her name tag before leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. You know, Brielle, in restaurants like this I expect experienced service, not someone who keeps smiling instead of moving faster. The conversation around the table grew noticeably quieter. Brielle kept her voice steady. I understand your concern, sir. I will make certain everything arrives as quickly as possible. Instead of accepting her response, Preston sighed dramatically. Do you? Because smiling does not make dinner appear. Maybe this job is simply too much for you. One of his business associates shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but nobody interrupted. Brielle felt the familiar sting behind her eyes. Yet years of serving difficult customers had taught her that dignity often lived inside silence. She nodded respectfully, confirmed each order carefully, and thanked them before walking toward the kitchen without changing the gentle expression on her face. From table 12, Julian observed every word. His coffee remained untouched. His expression revealed nothing at all. Even the bartender glanced toward him, expecting some reaction. None came. Julian simply folded his hands together and looked out the snow-covered window while the dining room slowly returned to its conversations. The kitchen staff exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered that Mr. Ashford had surely heard everything. Another quietly wondered why he had done absolutely nothing. Brielle returned a few minutes later carrying steaming entrees with the same grace she always displayed. She served Preston first despite his earlier remarks. Please be careful. The plate is very hot. Preston accepted it without looking at her or offering so much as a thank you. Brielle continued serving every guest at the table before wishing them an enjoyable evening. As she walked away, Julian briefly lifted his eyes to meet hers. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet sadness that seemed deeper than before. He gave the smallest nod, almost invisible to everyone else, and then finished the last sip of his coffee. Moments later, he placed his payment beneath the check holder, thanked Brielle as he always did, buttoned his coat, and disappeared into the snowy Chicago night without another word. Watching him leave, several employees exchanged puzzled looks. They had expected a powerful man to defend the waitress everyone admired. Instead, he had remained completely silent. None of them realized that the most important conversation of the evening had not yet begun, and it would take place far away from the warm lights of Hawthorne House. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale winter sunlight, and Hawthorne House opened as it always did, with the comforting aroma of fresh bread, polished wood, and coffee slowly filling the quiet dining room. Brielle Monroe tied her apron, greeted every co-worker with the same cheerful smile, and began preparing for another long shift. She assumed the uncomfortable encounter from the previous evening had already become another story to forget, one more difficult customer among hundreds she had served over the years. She never imagined that while she was arranging silverware beside the hostess stand, events had already begun unfolding far beyond the restaurant walls. Across downtown Chicago, Preston Whitmore entered the conference room of his corporate headquarters expecting an ordinary morning of meetings and contract negotiations. Instead, his assistant stood waiting with an expression he had never seen before. Several important clients had unexpectedly postponed scheduled discussions. A charitable foundation had quietly withdrawn from a partnership announcement planned for later that week. Two respected investors requested additional time before signing agreements that everyone had considered routine only 24 hours earlier. None of those decisions came with accusations or dramatic confrontations. Every conversation remained courteous. Every email sounded professional. Every phone call ended respectfully. Yet one after another, opportunities simply slipped away. Confused, Preston spent most of the morning trying to understand why people who had eagerly returned his calls for years suddenly sounded distant and unusually cautious. Just after noon, the owner of Hawthorne House received a brief phone call from an old friend who happened to sit on the board of one of Chicago's largest philanthropic organizations. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, the owner quietly placed the receiver down and remained standing beside his office window, thoughtful and unusually silent. A few minutes later, he walked into the dining room and asked Brielle if she would join him before lunch service began. She followed him nervously, wondering whether she had unknowingly made another mistake. Instead, the owner closed the office door and offered her a seat. Brielle, he began gently, I owe you an apology. She looked at him with genuine confusion. Sir, he sighed softly. I watched what happened last night. I should have stepped in sooner. I allowed one guest's attitude to become more important than the dignity of someone who has represented this restaurant with kindness every single day. Brielle quickly shook her head. Please do not worry about it. Difficult evenings happen. He smiled sadly. Perhaps, but that does not make them acceptable. He reached into his desk drawer and handed her a handwritten note announcing an employee recognition bonus along with 3 additional paid days off that she could use whenever she wished. Brielle stared at the paper in disbelief. I do not understand. Neither do I, the owner admitted honestly. This morning I was reminded by someone I deeply respect that the character of a business is revealed by how it treats the people serving inside it, not only the customers walking through its doors. Brielle thanked him sincerely, still unable to understand what had inspired such an unexpected conversation. She never asked who had made the phone call because gratitude mattered more to her than explanations. That evening, just before 8 o'clock, the familiar black SUV appeared outside once again. Julian Ashford entered the restaurant exactly as he always did, carrying himself with quiet composure. Nothing about his expression suggested that his morning had been unusually busy or that he had spoken to anyone on Brielle's behalf. He simply greeted the hostess, accepted his usual table, and waited patiently. When Brielle approached with her welcoming smile, she noticed something different. Good evening, Mr. Ashford. He returned the greeting warmly. Good evening, Miss Monroe. She hesitated for only a moment before speaking. Thank you for last night's generous tip. Julian offered a gentle smile that reached his eyes. Kindness should never leave anyone feeling alone. The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet something inside Brielle quietly shifted as she looked at him. For the first time since he had begun returning night after night, she sensed that his silence had never been indifference. It had been patience, waiting for the right moment to let respect speak louder than recognition ever could. For several days, nothing unusual seemed to happen, at least not on the surface. Julian Ashford continued arriving at 8 o'clock with quiet consistency, ordering the same dinner, thanking the same staff members, and leaving before the dining room emptied. Brielle Monroe continued treating him exactly as she treated everyone else. If anything had changed between them, it existed only in the brief moments when their eyes met across the softly lit restaurant. There was less uncertainty now, replaced by a quiet familiarity neither of them tried to explain. One evening, the last family finished dessert earlier than expected, and the restaurant settled into one of those rare, peaceful moments when even the kitchen seemed to breathe more slowly. Brielle carried a fresh cup of black coffee toward Julian's table. I did not order another cup, he said with a gentle smile. I know, Brielle answered. You looked like you were still thinking about something, and the chef had a fresh pot ready. I thought you might enjoy it. Julian looked at the steaming cup for several seconds before quietly saying, Thank you. She nodded politely and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her before she reached the next table. Miss Monroe. She turned back. Yes, sir. Julian looked toward the empty chair across from him, then motioned gently toward it. Would you sit down for just a minute? Only if you have time. Brielle hesitated. Restaurant policy discouraged servers from sitting with guests, but the dining room was nearly empty, and the owner, who happened to notice from across the room, offered an encouraging nod. She carefully took the seat opposite Julian, folding her hands in her lap. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable, like two strangers standing beneath the same quiet snowfall. Finally, Julian reached into his coat pocket and placed the old photograph on the table between them. Brielle picked it up carefully. The smiling waitress in the picture wore a vintage uniform from another era, yet something about her expression felt strangely familiar. She has kind eyes, Brielle said softly. Julian smiled. She did. Brielle looked up. Was she family? He slowly shook his head. No, but she changed my life without ever realizing it. He folded his hands together, his voice calm and steady. When I was 21, I believed success was measured by titles, expensive things, and the number of people who knew my name. My mother kept bringing me to a small diner every Sunday. I never understood why. Brielle listened quietly. There was a waitress there, Julian continued. She remembered every customer's story. She noticed when someone looked lonely. She celebrated birthdays, comforted grieving families, and somehow made ordinary people feel important without asking for anything in return. He paused as though hearing his mother's voice again. One afternoon, I asked my mother why she admired a waitress so much. She told me something I have never forgotten. She said, "The people who quietly restore another person's dignity are building a better world, even if nobody applauds them." Brielle lowered her eyes toward the photograph once more. "She sounds remarkable." "She was," Julian answered. "After my mother passed away, I searched for years hoping to thank that waitress properly. The diner had closed. She had disappeared. I never found her." The soft piano music drifting through the restaurant seemed to fade into the background as Brielle listened. Julian looked directly at her for the first time that evening. "Then one night I came here for a business dinner. I watched you comfort an elderly gentleman who could barely hold his coffee cup. You thought no one was paying attention." Brielle smiled shyly. "He reminded me of my grandfather." Julian nodded slowly. "That was the moment I heard my mother's lesson again. Not because you looked like the waitress. You do not. Not because you sounded like her. You did not. But because you carried the same quiet gift. You make people feel seen." Brielle felt unexpected tears gathering in her eyes. No promotion, compliment, or generous tip had ever touched her as deeply as those simple words. She had spent years believing that small acts of kindness disappeared the moment they were given. Sitting across from Julian, she realized they sometimes traveled farther than anyone could ever imagine. After that conversation, something subtle changed inside both of them, although neither one spoke about it again for several days. Julian Ashford continued returning each evening, but the silence between them no longer felt mysterious. It felt familiar, almost comforting, like two people quietly honoring the same memory without needing to explain it. Brielle Monroe found herself noticing details she had overlooked before. Julian always stood whenever an elderly guest passed close to his table. He quietly thanked every employee, from the hostess to the dishwasher, carrying heavy trays through the dining room. When children waved at him out of innocent curiosity, he always smiled back with surprising gentleness. She realized that beneath his calm reputation and quiet authority lived a man who paid close attention to the people most others ignored. One rainy Thursday, the restaurant became unusually busy after a downtown convention ended earlier than expected. Every table filled within minutes. The kitchen buzzed with steady urgency. Glasses clinked beneath warm golden lights, and conversations blended into a comforting hum. Brielle moved through the crowded dining room with practiced grace, balancing trays, answering questions, and remembering every special request without writing a single note. During the rush, a young father entered carrying his sleepy daughter while searching for an available table. Every seat appeared occupied. The little girl looked exhausted, resting her head against her father's shoulder as he quietly apologized for interrupting the busy evening. Before the hostess could respond, Julian rose from his own table. "Please," he said warmly. "They may have mine." The father immediately refused, embarrassed by the offer, but Julian simply smiled. "I have enjoyed this seat many evenings. Tonight I believe someone else needs it more." Brielle watched the exchange from across the room. The father thanked him repeatedly while helping his daughter settle into the comfortable booth beside the window. Julian accepted a smaller table near the back of the restaurant without the slightest hesitation. No one recognized the significance of what had happened except Brielle. For weeks he had requested that specific table every single night. She had quietly assumed it held some personal importance beyond explanation. Yet he had surrendered it in an instant simply because a tired child needed a place to rest. Later that evening, after most guests had gone home, Brielle carried his coffee to the smaller table. "You gave away the seat you always wanted," she said gently. Julian looked toward the family, still laughing together beneath the window. "My mother used to tell me that memories are never attached to furniture," he answered softly. "They travel with the choices we make." Brielle smiled, feeling those words settle deeply inside her heart. She must have been an extraordinary woman. Julian nodded. "She taught me that gratitude becomes meaningless unless it changes how we treat people." He paused before continuing. "For years I believed I came here because you reminded me of someone I had lost. I finally realized that was not true." Brielle listened quietly. Julian looked around the nearly empty restaurant where employees finished cleaning after another long day. "I kept returning because every evening you reminded me of the person I wanted to remain. Success has a strange way of surrounding people with admiration while quietly separating them from honesty." I needed a place where kindness still existed without expecting recognition. Brielle lowered her eyes, humbled by the sincerity in his voice. I have never done anything extraordinary. Julian smiled with quiet certainty. That is exactly why it matters. The world changes because ordinary people choose kindness on ordinary days when no one is watching. Neither of them noticed the restaurant owner standing near the office doorway, having overheard only the final sentence. He quietly removed his glasses, smiled to himself, and walked away without interrupting. For the first time since Julian had begun returning night after night, the mystery no longer belonged to the dining room. It belonged to something far greater, the quiet realization that a single person's daily compassion could restore hope inside someone carrying years of invisible sorrow, and that perhaps the greatest acts of generosity were the ones that looked completely ordinary to everyone else. Winter slowly surrendered to spring, and the view beyond the tall windows of Hawthorne House changed from drifting snow to fresh green leaves dancing beneath warm afternoon sunlight. Regular customers came and went. Birthdays were celebrated, anniversaries were toasted, and new faces filled the dining room each evening. Through it all, Brielle Monroe continued doing exactly what she had always done. She welcomed strangers with genuine warmth, remembered names without effort, noticed quiet sadness behind polite smiles, and offered simple kindness without expecting recognition. Nothing about her routine became grander because of Julian Ashford's presence. If anything, she became even more convinced that the smallest moments often carried the greatest meaning. Julian continued visiting, although no longer every single evening. Business often called him away to different cities, board meetings, and charitable events. Yet whenever he returned to Chicago, one familiar reservation appeared on the restaurant schedule. The staff no longer whispered about mysterious motives or hidden romances. They simply smiled when they saw his name because they understood that some guests returned for reasons that could not be measured on a menu. One quiet evening, nearly 4 months after Julian had first walked through the restaurant doors, Brielle arrived at table 12 expecting another peaceful dinner service. Instead, she found only a neatly folded envelope resting beside an untouched coffee cup. Julian stood by the window fastening his coat. "Good evening, Mr. Ashford," she said with the same gentle smile she had offered from the very beginning. He turned toward her, and there was peace in his expression unlike anything she had seen before. "Good evening, Miss Monroe." She glanced toward the envelope. "Did you forget this?" Julian shook his head softly. "No, it belongs to you." Brielle picked it up carefully and opened it after he nodded his encouragement. Inside rested a simple handwritten card. There was no expensive gift card, no business proposal, no check, and no invitation to another life. Only a few carefully written lines in elegant handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. Thank you for proving that my mother was right. And thank you for helping me remember the man I always hoped I could become." Brielle read the note twice before looking up again. Her eyes shimmered with quiet emotion. "I do not know what to say." Julian smiled with gentle gratitude. "You already said it every evening without realizing it." She folded the note carefully and held it close. "Will I see you again?" Julian looked around the restaurant one final time. The little family by the window laughed together over dessert. An elderly couple shared a slice of pie with 2 forks. A young server carried fresh coffee to a tired nurse still wearing hospital scrubs. Ordinary people living ordinary moments. "Yes," he answered, "but not because I need to find something anymore." He paused before continuing. "Now I come back simply because it feels like coming home." Brielle watched him walk toward the entrance with the same calm confidence he had carried since the very first evening. Yet somehow he looked lighter, as though an invisible burden had finally been set down. As the door quietly closed behind him, she slipped the handwritten card into the small notebook she carried inside her apron, placing it beside grocery lists, family reminders, and handwritten recipes from her grandmother. It belonged there because it reminded her that no act of kindness was ever truly forgotten. Somewhere, somehow, every quiet gesture continued traveling through lives we might never see. Outside, Julian paused for one brief moment before looking back through the restaurant window. Brielle happened to be helping an elderly customer put on his coat, smiling with the same effortless compassion that had first captured his attention months earlier. Julian nodded to himself, stepped into the evening, and disappeared into the city with a grateful heart. And on that day, the world quietly remembered what dignity looks like. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and sharing it with someone who still believes that kindness can change a life, because sometimes the smallest acts leave the greatest legacy.